All right. Hey, welcome everybody. It's good to see you. Glad that you guys are here this evening. Thanks for being punctual. Thanks for being on time for the conference. Just in case we haven't met, I recognize a lot of faces, but my name's Jared. This is my wife, Tiffany. I'm the lead pastor here at Green Hills. So welcome to Green Hills. In case you have not been here before, really glad to see you. And let me just say, we have been anticipating this night. We as a church, we've been looking for ways that we can just be a resource and provide some training for church members, for people all throughout the community in this area to kind of better handle mental health and to work through different things because there's just so much going on around us. I think we're all aware, not only personally, but we're aware of the need in so many people's lives all around us. So this is really important. Thank you for being here. We're glad that you're here. We're excited for this evening.
And this conference is called Not Alone because I think a really common lie that a lot of us believe is that we are actually alone, that we feel alone, we may be the only person who struggles. And I really think that that is a lie. And one of the best ways that I have found to overcome that feeling is just to be really honest with God or really honest with people in my own life or really honest in counseling. And so we just really hope that this can be and continuation of that journey for you and equip you with some tools.
Yeah, it has been a huge asset for us. So all the presenters that are speaking tonight are from SIFT. They might say a little bit more about the organization when they come up, but we're excited to partner with them. And I know for us, going to counseling, meeting with therapists throughout different seasons of our life has been a huge asset, whether that's marital counseling that we've gone through together, whether that's individual counseling, to get some tools and resources to say, how do I handle all this stuff that's going on in my life right now, where I'm kind of stuck in these different patterns, and having somebody to walk us through that. So I know we've both personally benefited from that and together as a couple as well. So let me kind of give a quick little preview of what tonight looks like, schedule. So everybody's in here for this first hour. We've got our first session in here where we're going to hear kind of this introduction to mental health, and you'll hear a little bit more about Kevin, the presenter, in just a minute. So this is going to go to about 7:30. At 7:30, we're going to let you guys stretch your legs, use the restroom if you need that. And we're going to have a 30-minute break. So as you leave this room at the end of this session, you're going to turn left, and we've got a patio back there that's got lots of desserts. We're going to sugar you up and caffeinate you up for the second session after that. That'll run from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. So you can mingle out there. There's a resource table from SIFT out there as well. But I'll be up after this presentation to do a little raffle. Okay, we got some raffles at the end of each session too, just as little gifts and thank yous that we get to send to you. I also wanted to mention that you can take notes if you'd like. I think the second session, both of those breakouts have some handouts and things like that you can work through. This room during the second session is going to be on regulating anxiety and depression. And if you signed up for the parenting adolescence, that's going to be out in the way that you came in, that front patio area. And there's another set of double doors in our fellowship hall. That's where the parenting breakout session will be. So if you want to take notes, that's fantastic. We are also going to record these sessions, and we will email that to you next week. That's for your own individual use, to look over that again, to watch that again, or maybe there's somebody in your household. This isn't to publish and just put all over the internet, things like that. This is just for your own benefit and edification to use once we send that your way. So with that being said, let me introduce Kevin. Kevin Van Lant is a licensed psychologist who serves as the Senior Director of Clinical Services. And so he has served at SIFT in various leadership and clinical roles for nearly 30 years. And in addition to his working at SIFT, Kevin serves as an associate professor at Biola University in La Mirada, where he teaches both clinical and pastoral counseling courses. His research and speaking interests are focused on mental health and the church, specifically the ways in which the church can better attend to the mental health needs of its congregants. So with that, would you welcome up Kevin Van Lant?
Well, thank you. It's really nice to be here. And a Friday night, this must be an important topic for you all to be here on a Friday evening, so I'm really glad you're here. Usually by this time on Friday, I'm pretty worn out, so attending this is important. How many of you are Dodger fans in the room? Any Dodger fans? Okay, after tonight's game, you'll want to stay for the depression and anxiety experience. I think you'll kind of need that. I think they just wanted to come back to LA to win it all. So that's, yeah, well, the LA hat. There you go. But more seriously, this is a topic, obviously, that's near and dear to my heart. And I've been in the clinical world for quite a long time now, and definitely seen an evolution, both in terms of what's going on with people relative to mental health. And I oftentimes think we use that term mental health, and we're oftentimes talking actually about illness. And so I might use those terms a little bit interchangeably tonight. And we'll do the best we can with that. And so let me just see what's up on the screen, okay? Let me start with this. This passage in Romans, and it's not the Romans 8:28 passage that you're oftentimes familiar with, but it's a little earlier in the text. And when I try to make sense of the mental health struggles that many of us experience and the suffering that goes along with it, I oftentimes come back to this passage because it really does help bring clarity to me about what we're wrestling with and what we're all wrestling with. And I think Paul does a really good job of describing this. So what's broken? Everything. Everything's broken. And why is everything broken? Well, Paul describes that in this passage, so I'll read it with you here. Romans 8:19-22, for the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. So there's already a waiting that's assumed here. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. I've never had a baby, but I've been nearby when a few were born, and it looks really, really painful and awful. And I'm surprised anyone has more than one just in that process. But what Paul's kind of describing here is all of creation is groaning as if in childbirth. That original sin, it broke everything. It broke the earth. Everything about the hurricanes that we had recently. It damaged relationships, both with God and with each other. It broke our bodies. We weren't created to die. And now there's illness and death. That when sin entered the earth, it impacted our mental health as well. And oftentimes what I sort of think the church has done is we've sort of set the brain apart, right? Like we have we're pretty accepting of the idea that the body gets sick, right? We can have various kinds of illnesses and diseases, and we don't really question that a whole lot. But somehow when there's a mental health issue, we question it differently. It has a different nature to it. And yet the brain is really just a part of the body, right? In fact, it's probably the most complex part of the body. And for most of human history, it's just been this black box that we don't really understand. Well, now we have fMRIs, and we've got CT scans, and we've got all these different ways that we can actually look into the black box for the first time and kind of see what's sort of going on in there. And so what we've learned about the brain in the last 30 years, I would say, 20 to 30 years, has been an exponential increase relative to almost all of human history. We know a lot about what's going on in the brain. We also don't know a lot about what's going on in the brain. There should be a lot of humility when we talk about this as well. So there's a brokenness, It broke everything. And part of what it did is impacted our capacity sometimes to see things clearly. It impacted our capacity sometimes to navigate relationships well. It impacted everything from the amount of serotonin your brain's able to sort of process, and it impacts mood like depression or panic attacks or all these kinds of things. So when we think about people, what I'd like to challenge you to do is really think about people holistically. So on the screen up there, when we're talking about mental health struggles or whole person struggles, we all sort of know this passage oftentimes from Mark 12, verse 30. How many of you sort of remember that passage from, right? So what's the verse saying? Well, Jesus is sort of describing us not as like these singular creatures. He's sort of describing us in multiple factors. So he's talking about love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. He's really encouraging us to love the Lord thy God with all of us. And we're not just one thing, we're quite a few things. And we can go into the philosophy behind that and the history behind that. But what I'd like to sort of highlight is when it comes to mental health struggles, this is both, well, not both. This is about how one is experiencing life biologically. Have you ever noticed when you're sick, it's really hard to be in a good mood when you're sick. It's really hard to feel good about anything when you're sick. When you have chronic pain, I don't know about you, but if my back is really hurting me, I'm kind of irritable, right? It's going to affect my mood. So we know just what we experience in this part of our body affects our mood, but we also know what's going on in this part of our body affects our mood as well. So we're biological creatures. We're psychological creatures. When we have children, and I'm imagining, how many of you have children? How many of you were children? Yeah, kind of all of us, right? We really care about what happens to our children, and we certainly really care what happens about them from 0 to 2. Seems to be a really important time. Well, why is that such an important time? They have no memory of it, right? You have no autobiographical memory before age 2 because your brain isn't developed enough to have autobiographical memory. So when you've taken your children to Disneyland when they're 1 and a half, you've taken them to all these like experiential sort of things, they will never remember them. They might remember the pictures that they see of the event, but they do remember something. So between 0 and 2, they're not learning it. They don't have an autobiographical memory of that time you took them to wherever, to the zoo. But they have a different kind of memory. What kind of memory do you think they have? Right? They have an instinct that starts to develop. So between 0 and 2, we develop a very profound instinct about, is the world a safe place or not? Are my needs going to get met or not? When I cry, is someone going to pick me up or not? When I'm hungry, is someone going to feed me? Right? When I'm scared, is someone going to comfort me? So we developed an instinct about the world before we have an autobiographical memory about our experience of the world. So when we're talking about psychology, and of course it goes well beyond 0 to 2, but I'm kind of using it as an example because when things are rough, when we're a kid, that doesn't just disappear. Right? It affects us. It affects us in some really important ways. Ways that I'm very optimistic as a therapist that can be worked through over time. But man, no one gets out of this thing unscathed. Right? Even the best of parents. My parents have passed, so I can share this story. They forgot me at church one Sunday. It was a double-decker bus, and all the kids got to ride on the double-decker bus, and my parents left to go have lunch. They went home. I was the youngest of 4. I think they were already exhausted, and forgot me at church. I was just a little kid, 5, 6, I don't know how old I was. I still remember sitting on the curb in front of the basketball court at church thinking, what am I going to do? right? That kind of panic that goes with that experience. I was just a little kid. So we all have these experiences on a minor level like that, or a more severe level, but it's part of our story. Social aspects. I love the fact that this conference is called Not Alone, because so much of our mental health struggles have to do with isolation and loneliness and social injury. We are oftentimes both traumatized in relationship, and oftentimes the repair and the healing has to happen in relationship too. So the difficult thing is when something happens relationally, the repair for that has to happen relationally too. But it's hard when you've been hurt, and it's hard to trust. Our spiritual lives, a meaningful connection to God obviously is profoundly important for us as humans. I don't even think I have to make a case for that. But sometimes what we've experienced in life influences how we think about God too. When we've experienced a lot of shame when we're kids, a lot of guilt when we're kids, it's really hard sometimes to see God as full of grace and mercy and love. And as Christians, we should be the most open to God's grace and healing. And yet oftentimes I find we struggle with shame and guilt just as much as anyone. So our spiritual lives matter. I could kind of ramble on and on about this, but I do want you to think about, when we talk about mental health, we're not just talking about one thing. We're talking about a lot of things. And the repair, the healing that comes usually has to take place on multiple levels as well. Some bad news. I'm just going to zoom through the bad news because it's Friday and nobody wants bad news on a Friday. But a little bit of data. I'm not going to spend much time on data, but I think it's important to know a couple of things. The last decade or two has been really rough on people's mental health. And it'd be great to just think it's COVID, but it's not just COVID. COVID definitely did some damage, but the struggles and the data in terms of the worsening of, at least in our country, but not just our country, the worsening of mental health rates was definitely increasing prior to that. A lot of the data started to turn around 2009. How many of you remember what happened in 2009-ish, 2010? Look, I love gadgets as much as the next guy. And this is my favorite toy. But it has really taken a hit on our mental health, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But how does that play out? And by the way, I'm not a hater of technology. You know, we have to figure out what to do with it. It's brought a lot of good as well. But from 2009 to 2019, the proportion of high school students who reported persistent feelings of sadness, of hopelessness, increased by 40%. Those who seriously contemplated suicide increased by 36%, and those who made a plan to take their own lives increased by 44%. Those were rough years on teens. What we know about teenagers, how many are teens in the rooms? Anyone? Okay. Is that about 50% of long-term mental health struggles begin by age 14 for about 50% of people. By age 17, 75% develop symptoms by this age. So the earlier we triage mental health issues, the better. Because by 14, right, 50% of the symptomatology that's been experienced at 14 is going to continue on long into life. And so catching this early on really does matter. And I'll let, I think Amy's going to talk about kids. So I'll let Amy talk about some of that. For adults and whatnot, according to this is from 2022, according to 2 national surveys completed as the pandemic wound down in December 2022, about 20% of mothers and 15% of fathers reported anxiety compared with 18% of teens. About 15% of teens reported depression alongside of 16% of mothers, 10% of fathers, In total, about 1/3 of teens had a parent suffering from reported anxiety or depression. Now, we're not talking about anxiety, depression like, oh, I'm a little depressed or I'm a little anxious. This is like clinical levels of anxiety and depression. So we throw a lot of, what's the term, shade on teens. But the parents are not all right. The parents are not all right. And so when we're talking about the mental health struggles of teens, we have to also talk about the mental health struggles of the parents, because the parents are wrestling too. In fact, as a percentage, wrestling at a little higher rate. So I don't want to throw teens under the bus. I think our culture tends to throw teens' mental health under the bus a lot, and I don't think that's fair. What the data also suggests is that one in five of the general population, and this is true within the church too, the church doesn't vary much, about 1 in 5 have diagnosable, 1 in 5 people have a diagnosable mental illness. So that's, I won't bore you with the details, but these are people who meet several criteria as defined by the American Psychiatric Association in terms of what a mental illness is. So they're suffering pretty heavily. I'm of the mindset that when you include what I would refer to as subclinical levels of mental illness, that means people who don't meet the full criteria but are suffering. We're probably looking at least 40%, at least 2 in 5. So every Sunday morning we go to church, there's a 1 in 5 chance that the person sitting next to you is struggling, is really suffering. Or maybe you're the one that's struggling or suffering. Probably 2 out of 5% chance that that person is struggling. And so I think this is why this kind of talk and this kind of evening is so important, because this is not an unusual, odd thing. This is much more common than we used to think. I'll have some Q&A time at the end as well. So why are mental illness rates so high and growing? I could ask 10 mental health professionals and they would give me probably 10 different answers. So this is really, some of it's a little research based, some of it's just anecdotal, but this is generally kind of what I'm seeing and what I'm believing. Increased rates of isolation resulting in increased loneliness. We hear a lot about the loneliness epidemic. I am a full believer that we are quite isolated relative to human history. We don't tend to live in smaller communities. We don't tend to know our neighbors very well. The church is a great place for community, and I'm hopeful that you're part of this community or a different church community. But on the whole, people are very isolated. And in my experience, men in particular are extremely isolated, especially 40-something and above. Men really struggle with making connections in adult life and beyond. It would seem odd that we're so lonely because we're theoretically so connected. And you read this all the time. If you read any stories, the little day-to-day stories in the LA Times or whatever, you're going to see this. But the technology doesn't seem to be connecting us. It would be nice if it did, but it's not really connecting us in any real meaningful way. So we're lonely, increased use of technology, particularly social media. And, people throw a lot of hate at social media. It's not going away. But if you want to be happier tomorrow, rid yourself of it. That's what all the data would suggest. It's a strange thing. It's like addictive, right? Like, what are we going to do if we get rid of it? What the data suggests, Cal Newport in his book, Digital Minimalism, and I've encouraged this with a number of my patients, and it really seems to work. He suggests that if you don't want to get rid of social media completely, just take it off your phone and only look at it on your computer. And immediately it becomes less interesting. Right? That sounds kind of weird, but it's true. Because a lot of times social media is just a thing to fill time, right? It's in front of you, it's always with you. And so if you want to literally be more content within 30 days, If you actually sort of either minimize or avoid social media, it's wild that that's true, but it is. Nihilism and spiritual despair. We are in many ways in a post-Christian culture. And that idea of nihilism really is related to this idea that it's all kind of meaningless, right? You're here for whatever few years you get in this life, and then it's over, and there's nothing you really live for beyond that. And I think the dilemma that we're partially experiencing, especially with the younger adult population, is they're not less spiritual. The data doesn't suggest that young people and Americans in general are less spiritual, but they're much less likely to be Christian. And that's kind of a dilemma for us as Christians. And I think that kind of spirituality without something more concrete, like the Christian faith, like Jesus, it leaves people kind of floating around without much to really hold on to. So they're sort of spiritual, but there isn't much to define it. And it still does sort of lead, I think, to that kind of nihilism that at least I've been seeing a lot. Actual and vicarious trauma. We live in an era where, and again, this is probably going back to the smartphone a bit, but your brain is not very good at differentiating other people's trauma from your own. And the hard part is that we are getting like real-time imagery of trauma that's happening halfway around the world that we're not connected to in any way, but because we see it so closely, it feels like it's more connected than it is. And you might be able to cognitively distance yourself from it, but your brain doesn't really know how to do that. I'm sort of anthropomorphizing your brain here for a second. But what I'm really suggesting is that when your brain is viewing traumatic experiences vicariously, it's experiencing it on some level as if it's your own. As if it's your own. And so we're watching a lot of trauma, we're viewing a lot of trauma, and our brain is kind of holding on to it. And that's a tough way to go through life, right? We have to sort of figure out, well, how are we going to do that? I always think of our brains relative to trauma as like the lint roller. Remember those, the lint roller with the masking tape on it, and you roll it over, and you're picking up trauma, and you're picking up trauma, and you're picking up trauma, and then you don't just get to peel off that outside layer and then get a fresh start again, right? How do we deal with trauma? Well, the first step is we have to talk about it. We have to be able to process it. Well, then when we go back to that issue of loneliness, who are we going to process it with? We're not connected enough to even talk it through more meaningfully. Pastors are particularly vulnerable to this, so be nice to your pastor, right? Pastors pick up a lot of vicarious trauma because they're there when the bad stuff happens. They're there when the good stuff happens too, but they're there when a lot of bad stuff happens. In my work with pastors, I find they pick up a lot of vicarious trauma over the course of their ministry life. The cultural shift towards overprotectiveness of children and the snowplow parent. If you're familiar with Nassim Taleb's work on anti-fragility, this idea that he's presenting, and there seems to be a lot of kind of data to back this up, is how do we create more resilient children? How do we create more durable children with more grit? Well, it's kind of the opposite of what we're doing now. Right? Families have gotten small. You have 1, 2 kids maybe nowadays. You've got a lot tied up in those 2 kids. There's a lot that's there. My dad was one of 13 kids. I doubt anybody knew where any of them were at any given point of the day, right? But when you've got 1 or 2, you're watching where they are on their Find My iPhone app. You're sort of aware of their every movement, which is a problem. I really would discourage you from overusing that. We are, as Jonathan Haidt would say, we really need to prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. So we need to prepare the child for the road, which means helping them become capable of suffering. Because the dilemma I see with a lot of my college students now is that they don't know how to suffer well. And we're all going to suffer, right? Breakups, heartache, physical issues, family issues. Like we all are going to experience this. And when they happen, we have to have some kind of durability to move through it. And so what Nassim Taleb would describe as anti-fragile basically means like, when I'm not suggesting you break your leg here, but when you break your leg and the leg heals, it's actually stronger where it heals than the bone tissue around the break. Right? And what he's suggesting, and I think there's a lot of truth to this, is that for our kids, we don't want them to suffer, but they will. So how do we help them move through the suffering well and not blame everything on everything else? And I could talk about this issue just by itself for the next hour, so I won't bore you with that. But societal tension, a culture of hopelessness. My word, I never thought in therapy I'd have to process people's fears about the election. And I'm literally in therapy, like, managing people's anxiety about the election. I was like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? So the culture is definitely, I used to think the culture was kind of like a third parent. It's like kind of helping put some training wheels and boundaries around the kid. Now I think it's like the crazy uncle you don't want it near. It's like stay away from it. The rates are somewhat better for church attenders, but remain high, particularly for youth. So I think what I'm suggesting is that being part of a faith community, being part of a church does not immunize you against suffering and mental health struggles. And I don't find anywhere in Scripture that we should expect not to struggle. I from beginning to end, I don't see anything in Scripture that suggests somehow as Christians we're going to bypass all this stuff. I think it's kind of a fool's errand to believe that. So we're going to go through it too. The disciples went through it. Jesus went through it. So we are going to wrestle with pain. And so what do we do with that with our congregants? So a couple of ideas, and I'll make sure I leave a little time for Q&A. Seeing the need. So this is, I think, for you all as kind of fellow Christians, how do you minister to those that are part of your church community, part of your family, maybe even to some degree yourself? I think part of it is like kind of opening up your eyes and sort of noticing that we're compelled through Scripture to carry each other's burdens, and in this way fulfilling the law of Christ. We're compelled not just because we may want to, but we're called to walk alongside others and help carry their burden. And their burden, it's easy, when easy. If they need some money, or they need some clothes, or they need, some paint in their house, whatever it might be. But carrying each other's depressive burdens, carrying each other's anxiety burdens, that gets hard because anxiety and depression are very contagious, right? When you're sitting with someone who's depressed, when you're sitting with someone who's anxious, man, you absorb that. You were built to be empathic. You're built to experience those feelings. And so that's not easy to do. And yet we're called to carry each other's burdens, I think, in that way as well. We should have at least a basic understanding of how to triage mental health issues, kind of differentiating in some ways between what's an emotionally just kind of difficult time versus actual mental illness. And I can't do that all with you today. And if you ever want to go on a deeper dive, I'd be happy to come back and talk about this more fully. I think Yesenia you're going to talk about that a bit. But how do we differentiate between just somebody who's struggling, because we're all going to struggle, versus somebody who's really suffering under the weight of an actual mental health issue? Coming alongside someone who might be struggling, kind of basic assessing, kind of listening skills, clear guidance, know your limitations, know when to ask for help. And then how do we do that? Well, a couple of thoughts. One is, some of you are really great listeners. How many of you think of yourself as a really great listener? Yeah, handful of you, right? How many of you not? Well, don't raise your hand. Okay, the rest of you. we tend to be horrible listeners. Did you ever notice that? I have my pastoral students. This is great. So my pastor students, I have them do role plays where they role play out like counseling sessions, right? Like pastoral care kind of counseling sessions. They're like about 10, 12 minutes long. I tell them from get-go, don't try to solve their problem. Don't try to fix it. Just learn how to be a good listener. About 2 minutes in to the role play, they almost all start trying to fix and solve and tell them what to do. We don't tend to be very good listeners because it's hard to be a good listener. Like it's much harder to be a good listener than it is to tell people what you think. That's pretty easy. It's pretty easy. So it really starts with just listening to people's story and kind of trusting that just letting someone tell their story has value in and of itself, because it actually does. So when you're caring for somebody who's struggling with a mental health issue, the first thing you do is listen. Don't try to fix it. You can't fix it. You can't even fix your own problems, right? Really, I can't either. Right? We can't even fix our own problems. So we really have to kind of work at helping people kind of move toward their own solutions to their problems as well. Listen for key words such as things like I feel down, I feel hopeless, I cry a lot, I'm lonely all the time, I'm at my wit's end, tired all the time, like these kinds of things. No one cares. These are a lot of words used by people who are depressed. This is really common language with people who are depressed. And so when you're hearing these kinds of words, some part of you might be kind of thinking, I wonder if something's going on with this person I need to be attentive to. If you have kind of earned the right in your connection with someone, don't be afraid to ask deeper questions. How are you really doing? How are you really doing? I sometimes will tell, again, my pastor students, when they have a congregant who's had a baby and they show up for church, that third week after the baby's born or whenever they're brave enough to come to church with the baby, I usually I'll encourage the pastor to ask the mother, how are you really doing? Because sometimes, it's hard to have a newborn. And it's, the baby blues are pretty common. So it wouldn't be unusual if you're feeling some of that. So ask the deeper kind of questions. Don't just take the surface level answers. Use empathy, good listening skills, normalize aspects of their experience. I think these become really key. And then a little more further, and some of this I've said, but resist the urge to tell people what to do. How many of you like to tell people what to do? I love the honesty. Yeah, I love that hand. So we love telling people what to do. I don't know, it's just second nature. I think it's a problem. Have a prepared list of resources and a warm handoff. If you don't know, like if you're part of this community and you interact with somebody who's really struggling, or maybe you're struggling, there are people here who know who to help, who might help you. So if you're in a leadership role, it's really important to know who to hand that person off to. Jared and some of the other folks here, Pastor Jared, I'm sure have people that they know who to hand people off to. But if they're struggling, you need to find that next kind of level of care for that person. And oftentimes we don't really know how to do that alone, so you might need some help, depending on what you're doing in the context of ministry here. Pray for them and follow up. Avoid platitudes and simplistic answers. I had an experience just this week with a person who had tried to keep it very remote. A person who had the death of a loved one. And it had happened several months ago. It wasn't, just last week, but it had happened relatively recently. And she came in and she started telling me just how hurtful it was in terms of what people were saying to her. And they were all kind of Christian platitudes. And the people were well-intentioned, I'm sure. They were really trying to say something that they thought would be helpful. But it actually was really hurtful. And so be careful with comments like it's going to be okay. God won't give you anything more than you can bear. God has a plan through all of this. Somewhere in it all, you're going to come out the other end and it's going to be better. Those statements only work in the rearview mirror. Those are statements that only sort of resonate after you've been through it. So my encouragement to you is when you are praying with people who are suffering and struggling, pray as if you're entering into the suffering with them. Pray for God's presence in the midst of the suffering, that his grace or his love would be kind of clear to this person in the midst of the suffering. Because God does want to join us in the suffering. There's a guy named Alvin Plantinga, who probably most of you have never heard of. He's probably one of the top Christian philosophers not that long ago. He spent his whole life studying the problem of evil. And he got to a point in his career, he's elderly at this point, and he said, he goes, the only thing that really makes sense to me about suffering after all my studying is that we have a God who didn't avoid suffering, that we have a God who entered into our experience and suffered with us and suffered for us. So we have a God who will enter into our suffering, and so invite God into that experience and to help you make sense of that experience, or to help the person you're talking to make sense of that experience. I don't know about what's going on here at Green Hills, but I love care ministry, because not everybody needs somebody like me or Yesenia or Amy. Like, you need each other. You need each other. And I love it when a church has the capacity and sort of the vision of how do we care for these people within our community, because you do need each other. And how do you support each other? Because long after, you're done with someone like me, my hope is that you're really, really connected with each other. So this community is really important. Attend to your own feelings of powerlessness. This goes back to the fixing problem. Some people just want to be heard, right? Why is being heard so important? Well, because not being heard hurts. It's painful when you're talking to someone and you can kind of notice they're thinking about something else, or they're just waiting for the next sentence to sort of speak to you. It's painful to experience that. And it feels really good to have someone listen empathically with us. Part of the reason for that is the way God built you, you have this whole neural network called a mirroring neural network. How many of you have heard of mirroring neural networks? Yeah, a few of you. Right, so your brain loves another brain that is firing the same way yours is. I've tried to get my hands on this video for many years. Out at UCLA, they did a really interesting study, and if you can picture a baby and a mother, the baby's probably about 4 or 5 months old, kind of sitting in a little car seat, and you can see the baby's face and you can see the mother's face. They also have they're taking readings of the brain activity of the mother and the mother and child at the same time. So there's 4 images on the screen. There's the mother's face, the baby's face, mother's brain, baby's brain. And the mother and the baby are kind of interacting with each other the way mothers and babies do. And their brains are firing exactly the same. Their 2 brains look identical. Like, you could not distinguish between the 2. And then at one point in time, the baby kind of reaches out and pulls on the mom's earring. Really fascinating. It's all real time. Pulls on the mom's earring, and the mom goes, ow, grabs her ear. And the baby gets startled and scared and starts to cry. The mom takes a second to kind of realize what's going on. And then she starts to soothe the baby. When the baby pulls on the mom's earring and the mom says, ow, and the baby starts to cry, what do you think their brains do? Completely different, right? They are firing as differently as one can imagine. Mom starts soothing the baby, rubbing the baby's, shoulder and arm and the leg. It's okay, baby. It's okay, baby. Their brains slowly, within a couple minutes, start firing exactly the same again. Okay? That's what the person you're ministering to, that you're talking to, that's struggling, that's what they're looking for from you, and that's what you're looking for from others. You're looking for an empathic experience. You're not looking for someone to solve the problem. That's not what they're looking for. It's not what you're looking for. And what we find is that empathy is healing. That empathic connection alone is reparative to the brain, which is kind of bizarre to think about, but it really is. And so I want to sort of lower the bar for you in terms of how you respond to others that are struggling with mental health issues, and even what you need in the context of mental health issues, because that connection, that empathic connection, is just so fundamental and so key. And then lastly, I like the idea of you don't have to know the full path towards wholeness and healing and growth. You really just have to know what the next step is. What's the next thing that I can do to either care for myself, to care for my psychological well-being, to care for the psychological well-being of others in my life? I can't take them the whole way oftentimes, but I can kind of take them another step. And sometimes that's great, right? Sometimes just that one next step is great. So with that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A if that's okay. I covered a lot of territory. We could talk about any one thing that I brought up probably for an hour or two. So, but I don't know how you want to manage the questions. But yeah. Any questions?
Is there a hand that went up?
About losing a pet, 18-year-old pet. Do you go through the same sorrows? Do you, yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I love animals, so I'm just a big animal guy. And I'm particularly intrigued by dogs because I feel like God kind of gave us dogs. And I feel like he kind of gave us dogs because somehow it always seems like they kind of resonate with us, right? They just did an interesting study with dogs where they wired them up to see what was going on in their brains when we're interacting with them. Dogs, this is really true, dogs have an empathic response to us, and their brains start to align with our brain. We don't do that with dogs, which is kind of curiosity, right? We're not as empathically tuned to the dog as the dog is with us. I say that because our connection to animals is oftentimes really meaningful. And I find that when we have, we've had 2 golden retrievers. The last one after she died, my wife said, I just can't go through this again. Like, I just can't get another dog again. They won't live long enough, right? So we do grieve all the same kind of grieving steps, oftentimes with the animal that we're really connected to, that we do with others, with the humans as well.
Okay, yeah. We got one in the back here.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have 2 questions. The first one is, have you ever heard of post-finasteride syndrome?
Can I ask you to say it? I didn't quite catch that.
The name of the illness is post-finasteride syndrome.
I'm just not, my hearing's a little funny. I'm not quite catching it.
Okay. So it's post-finasteride syndrome.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. Right. Then second question, you showed all these statistics, and what classifies actually as a mental illness?
Yeah, so a mental illness technically is something that meets the criteria in this thing we call the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So the American Psychiatric Association produces this manual. It's got about 650 different disorders in it. It kind of overwhelms my students, but it's criteria that someone technically has to meet to be diagnosed. So we use that. Is it a perfect guide? No. It's got its flaws. And we all of us in the mental health field struggle with it on some level, but it's kind of the only thing we've got. So, yeah.
I just really wanted to applaud you and this church. This is the most healthy conversation I have ever heard, and especially in Christianity. So I had no idea that discussions like this were going on. Since we sort of live near Biola, and I really respect what you're saying, does Biola offer any further conferences that communities can attend, or how can we get more information, especially some of your teaching from the outside?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question. I mean, there are things kind of going on all the time there. I work with an organization called SIFT Counseling. It stands for the Center for Individual and Family Therapy. So if you get online with SIFT Counseling, there are a number of, we do these trainings and pastors forums. We do a couple of them a year, and the audio recordings of them are there. There's some really great stuff there. I'm imagining Biola has a lot online, but I wouldn't even know where to begin to tell you to find those. So YouTube for Biola, yeah. It's like a voice in the ether back there. It's like.
Is there anyone else who's got a question? Yep.
I'd like to know what advice you would give to a teenager or a young person if they are attacked through social media in regards to their body image, any negative feedback, insults. What would you tell them?
I can tell you what I would tell them, but Yesenia will probably Amy will probably speak to some of this more fully. So I'd encourage you to join her. Number one, I think the dilemma is we open ourselves up to dozens, if not hundreds, if not more, people's opinions about us when we get on social media. And we give a lot of weight to those negative opinions. In fact, we're really wired up to be more attentive to negative opinions than to positive opinions. So there's an old saying about you have to give 10 compliments for every one negative statement. I don't even think 10 to 1 is accurate. It's probably many times more than 10 to 1, because the one like just grinds on us. It just sits in there and grinds on us. And when we've been wounded in that way, I think probably depending on how it's affecting, I don't know if it's your daughter or whomever it might be, but however it's affecting that person, I think that's probably when, believe it or not, I think therapy might really be necessary, because it's activating something, and there's something there for it to activate. And especially for young females, where body image is such a vulnerable kind of part of their experience, getting some help and talking that through in terms of what it's really triggering for them, I think is going to be really key. We can do our best as parents, but the problem is when you're a parent, you're so close to it, and it's hard sometimes really being able to kind of walk them through that. So that could be the kind of thing where therapy would be really helpful. I'd actually encourage you to think about it. But I hate social media. Like, I just hate it like the plague. I really do. So if you use it, bless you. I don't know. A lot of people use it. Probably almost all of you use it. But it is a plague. My wife and I were out for a walk the other day, and she just asked these random questions. She goes, if there was one thing, if you were king and there's just one thing you could do to make life better for people, what would it be? And I said, get rid of social media. Like, if we could just eradicate it off the planet. So but it's here to stay. It's not going away. We've got to find a way to sort of use it well. If you're a parent and you're kind of wondering, how do I sort of attend to social media, or not just social media, but technology within the family context, I'd actually encourage you to look up a guy named Cal Newport. And Cal Newport is a professor, I think at like Yale. He's like a technology professor at Yale. He's not anti-technology, but he's all about how do we manage technology better, and especially for our children. So he's not a Christian, but the content is so solid, and I don't know of anybody who's writing on that topic better than him. So,
You want to take maybe one more, if there's one more? Maybe not. Is there one more question out there?
So I just think of people and those who struggle with panic attacks or those things. And sometimes when you tell a Christian person, and you often get the same response how you mentioned, it's going to be okay. How do you help sit with someone where they need more than just, it's going to be okay?
how many hours do we have to say? I think that's why we're talking about it, so you at least don't do the opposite, right? Don't do the other side of it, the platitudes and whatnot. I think it's just we're listening and normalizing. I mean, like, I venture to say, I can't remember the data exactly, but at least 50% of people will have a panic attack at some point in time in their life. I mean, that's half this room has had something approximating a panic attack. So really being able to normalize the experience, if you're sitting with someone who's in the midst of having a panic attack, one of the first things I encourage people to do is just to slow down their breathing. Just be present with them, attentive to them, comforting to them. But one of the fastest ways to actually decrease the experience of a panic attack is to slow your breathing down. Because when you slow your breathing down, you're telling your brain there's no threat. But that really quick respiratory rate definitely activates that. So I'm okay with this young man asking a question because he's been sitting so perfectly.
Hello.
Hi.
So in my middle school, I just also been noticing with my fellow classmates that there's like, even with those who are Christian, there's like a problem with them like striding away from their faith, and they're starting to take part of activities, and they're starting to do things that doesn't define them or what they believe in. And I was just wondering how you feel about how one oddball or just one bad thing could spread so quickly to so many other kids, even if it's against what they believe in, and how it could go under the radar of parents.
Yeah. That's a really great question. I think it's a Jared question on some of them. But my personal sort of lament, and I really appreciate your question. What's your name, by the way? Joel, yeah. I think we live in an era where the pressures were being more formed by the culture than we are by Scripture. And the culture is such a powerful force, and I'm not anti-culture. I mean, we all have lived in a culture. But we are kind of living in an era where there is less accommodation for faith, especially Christianity. And so it takes a lot of courage to hold to something when a lot of your peers and a lot of other people are sort of going a different direction. But I think that's where holding to your community here, to your youth leaders, I don't know if you're talking about yourself or other people, but really allowing your life to be formed by Scripture and by faith. And that's kind of countercultural right now. That's not something we're doing. But it's happening everywhere. And I think just having that awareness is probably a key for you. You know, we can't really do a lot sometimes for the rest of what's going on with people, but we certainly have to attend to our own heart. So, but anyway, thanks for the question, though.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for taking. Well, hopefully you picked up on a few nuggets there that you really helpful for you. I know one of the things I just kept hearing is the value of community and the relationships around us. That sometimes we think we're such individual people, but we're really not. We are so interconnected to one another in the community around us. So we are about to take a break. I'm going to do a